in our training and in our lives, we actually need to be very good detectives. Batman is considered, at least in most comics, and by most people, the world's greatest detective. And obviously, we're not going to be doing a course on detective work. I am not a detective. I'm neither a private detective nor a formal law enforcement detective. I do not have that skill set. I don't know about forensics. I don't know about intelligence gathering to that capacity, anything like that. Those are probably important skills to learn for some people, and for other people perhaps less important. But we can use some of the principles of the overarching idea of detective work, that is, gathering intelligence and drawing conclusions based on evidence and the application of logic and science. We can apply that to our training because, again, on this channel, my business, my career is based around training for martial arts and fitness. That is the domain that I operate in. And presumably that is the reason that you're watching this video. We have a few things to cover here, but let's start off with a jumping off point. And that jumping off point is basically human motivation. It is self-determination theory. Now, self-determination theory is one among many theories, but it's one that I particularly subscribe to. There are three fundamental principles that self-determination theory is based on, and that is autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Now, this is a theory of motivation, right? So this doesn't get into things like, philosophy or problem solving or anything like that. What it gets into is motivation, the things that kind of keep us going, right? And there's a lot of data to back up at least aspects of self-determination theory, whether you buy it whole hog or just take it as part of the puzzle. But the thing is that it goes into that whole, like if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, self-actualization is at the top. So the idea of understanding motivation is to aid in self-efficacy and self-actualization, which we can argue is Batman's ultimate reason for existing, right? He had a very, very scarring tragedy happen to him at the beginning, and he went on this journey to not only basically try to somehow right that wrong and protect people, but he really did it almost as a coping mechanism for how could I prevent this from happening? Like, what could I do to make this never happen again, right? Now, clearly, the comics are still going. 85 years later, Batman still exists, which means he does not achieve his goal. But if we're looking at the goal as he's trying to eliminate violent crime, yeah, that's not going to happen. But if his actual goal underneath all that is really just that self-efficacy, self-actualization, that personal journey, then that's a pretty important idea, right? So why is autonomy important? Well, because we're all individuals at our core, even when we are operating in groups, right? There's no such thing as an actual collective. When we operate in groups, what we are doing is we are cooperating as individuals, because each one of us is in that group fulfilling something in that group. Otherwise, the group would be full and there would be no room, right? There would be unnecessary redundancy. So we are always part of a group acting as individuals. And so having that autonomy really lets us not only kind of understand ourselves as beings, because we all have this individual perception of I am not you. We might be similar, we might have similar motivations, we might have similar end goals, etc. But we all have this innate perception, observation of I am not of I am not you. And that raises all sorts of existential questions. And so developing a sense of autonomy and a place in the world and all of that really, really helps. This is actually part of where relatedness comes in too, right? Relatedness allows us to know how we fit into that cooperative network and honestly into the competitive network as well. Relatedness is extremely important because we are ultimately social creatures. And so on top of that autonomy, we need to know who and what we are relative to others, how we relate to others. That is an extremely important thing, right? Because it allows us to kind of categorize and place things into hierarchies, and which are inevitable and necessary. Very, very, very important. And then competence, right? Competence ultimately, this is where we have a lot of data. Competence actually breeds motivation, not the other way around, right? It is very difficult for external motivation to manifest itself into consistent habitual behavior, whereas competence does. Because when you're good at something, we have natural biological and environmental reward systems in place, both natural and and like socially constructed, right, artificial ones in place that actually rewards competence. And competence being rewarded creates incentive for those behaviors to persist, because we want that end result to persist, right? So competence is extraordinarily important, and we see this in the character of Batman, and we should be seeing this in our martial arts practice. And now this is a good tip for you who are actively teaching, whether you are coaching as a teacher or tutor, or if you are kind of participating in group coaching as in like a group of peers, like the college study group that I was part of for many years. So this is an important idea, right? So we need to then have a kind of, let's say, a methodology for going about some of this stuff, right? How do we achieve the end goals and all that? So I've outlined a couple of concepts that are very broad and general things, right? Let's start off with the concept of Socratic inquiry. So look, Socrates was almost entirely interested in how do I live a good life? How do I proceed being a moral person? We can still apply that beyond morals and ethics into the greater sphere of things. And generally speaking, what the Socratic method teaches is really a method for discovery of truth. And so distilled down, right? Because this is not a method that is step-by-step outlined in Plato's dialogues or anything, right? It's all secondhand information, but it's stuff that has been reconstructed based on the nature of Plato's dialogues about Socrates. And so for the ability to discover what is true, right, which is our knowledge base, that sounds like Batman, right? We need to know what is true. We need to have knowledge, right? Why does Batman know every martial art? Why does Batman have 12 PhDs? Why does he speak every language, right? Because there is a certain knowledge base that he deems that he has to have to achieve his goal, right? So that means that we have to be able to discover truth. Well, first we have to define it, right? And this is huge in Socrates. We have to be able to define things. Now, we can go deep into the Socratic method, but there's other people far more qualified. You can go just dig in Socratic method on YouTube, and you can find hours and hours and hours of lectures and discussions and everything to kind of figure out what that is. But just a quick breakdown here. We always want to, we have to establish an argument, right? And this is generally, an argument is generally going to be some kind of assertion about reality, right? An assertion about what we know. Now, we'll come back to some refinements on that, but we have to have a jumping off point. Like, we don't start from, whatever, primal energy and matter and go up towards whatever, right? That we can't go through the evolutionary process with our knowledge, because if there's no end goal, there's no path, right? So in a sense, we have to start with an assertion because we need a problem to solve. We almost have to reverse engineer everything, right? We always have to start with, here is something that I need to know. Let's start with an observation, an assumption, a hypothesis, a question, right? We have to start with that, right? So we establish an argument. Then we have to start, in the case of the strict Socratic method, right, from the argument, because we are talking about moral assertions or truth assertions, then we have to go and raise exceptions and contradictions, i.e., we have to figure out what we don't know, or we have to figure out where we have holes in our logic, right? We need, and this is really where like the discourse side of it comes in, right? We need to be bouncing ideas off of other individual agents. This is that both autonomy and relatedness coming in together, because we don't really always know what we don't know. And so having somebody with a different perspective, different experiences, different observations and whatnot come in and counter us with counter arguments, or at least exceptions and contradictions, helps us refine our arguments. And that's the next step, right? Officially, you're going to be looking to reformulate your argument to exclude those exceptions, or to at least refine your argument. And then you just repeat that into infinity, right? Because the ultimate Socratic truth is that we don't know anything. And of course, out of that grew the school of skepticism, which, depending on how hard-nosed you want to be, either says we don't know stuff or we can't know stuff. Generally speaking today, though, when we talk about skepticism, we're generally talking about show me proof. We're not talking about a complete rejection of knowledge. We're just talking about let's get some kind of empirical evidence going in on that. But you basically just repeat this process of argument, exceptions, refine, over and over and over again. And this is how you drill down to truth. One of the big things on this too is this helps you define terms. Why on this channel do I spend so much time defining terms? Because it's important. If we can communicate effectively back and forth between each other, we can have more meaningful dialogue and discourse. And if we can have more meaningful communication, then it is going to be easier to get at truth, right? All right, so moving on from Socratic inquiry, let's go to scientific method, right? Because we've already, like, the root of scientific is knowledge, to know, right? So the idea of is we're looking for truth, and then the scientific method is, again, a rigorous, logical, practical, experimental method of trying to dig down into that, right? So we start with, and this is just like the basic overview process, right? This is something you learn in like high school biology, high school chemistry, right? You might even learn this in like junior high school. And so we start off with an observation or question. Well, that's a lot like establishing an argument, but it's a little more open-ended, right? And it's going to be not so much around, morality and truth. It's going to be more around phenomenon. Then you do research on the topic, right? Because now in the modern world, we live in a time and place where we have generations upon generations, millennia of insights, knowledge, observations, and actually collated data that we can search through, and that can help us refine that question. Sometimes we can answer that question without going through the rest of it because it's already been answered and we were just ignorant of the fact that it's been answered. Other times, our specific question hasn't been answered as specifically as we'd like, but going through that research allows us to drill down and get closer to what we're actually searching for. Sometimes our observation or question is a little vague, and it's good for us to be able to bring that into focus, right? Then from there, we can actually formulate a hypothesis, which again is going to be going to establishing an argument, right? So this entire process, observation or question, research topic, form a hypothesis, really is just this first piece of the Socratic method. Now, it is in a sense, right, because your research is going to do a little bit of raise exceptions and reformulate argument too, right? So this initial bit of observation, question, research topic, form, hypothesis is really mirroring the Socratic method in a somewhat loose sense. And then, instead of just arguing ad nauseum, what we do is we create experiments with appropriate methods, right? Methodology is incredibly important, right? Some methods are better than others because there is all sorts of uncertainty and noise that can be included in things. And this is why we do things like control groups and trying to find as large of a sample size as possible. We want meaningful time frames. We actually want parameters that mimic the real world that we're actually trying to test. If things are too divorced from reality, they don't work out too well. Sometimes you have to go through multiple layers of different kinds of testing. Sometimes that's for ethics reasons. Sometimes that's for financial reasons. Because there is a hierarchy of evidence. And look, there's a whole argument we can make about evidence. There is like scientifically valid evidence. There's legally valid evidence that you would be talking about in courtrooms and stuff. There's even like journalistic ethics that comes into how we're communicating and reporting things. So this whole thing about experimenting using appropriate methods, and then honestly getting into analyzing the data and creating our reports, this all goes into that side of things of creating evidence, cataloging where that evidence goes in the hierarchy of evidence, reporting on it and communicating it accurately without making it seem more or less important than it is. That's going to be very, very important as well. So this just takes from this Socratic inquiry, this look for truth, and it drills it down into something that Socrates really couldn't have done, which is adding in that like especially technologically driven experiment. There are just things that couldn't even have been conceived of back then. And that's going to be really important. And then analyzing data and getting your reporting and your communication right. These are things that are all fairly modern. And luckily we live now rather than then, right? So we are more capable of getting at truth than we were then. Now, I'm not saying in your martial arts and training that you need to personally be involved in scientific experiment, but you should probably be at least looking at research that is pertinent to it, or at least tangentially associated in a way that you can draw some inferences from it, right? All right. And then the last part that we're going to look at is just general problem solving and logic, right? Logic is different from science in the sense that logic is about putting puzzle pieces together in a way that leads you to the correct conclusion. And that logic generally only has a place either when you're analyzing data so that you get the pieces in the right order to frame the correct picture, because again, we want truth, or logic is a stand-in for not having enough data, and you use the available data and logic to create bridges between some gaps in the data that at least allows us to model things. And this is the thing that we're getting at with problem solving and logic, right? So we start with premises, and then we have to navigate through fallacies and biases, right? Which really kind of gets back into this stuff. And then we have to use established knowns to navigate the unknowns. It's what we just talked about, right? This is how like geometric proofs work. You have givens, which are your known quantities, things that we know to be true because they have been established to be true, or at least are presumed to be true until further evidence dictates otherwise. And we use that to navigate our unknowns. And this is how we create geometric proofs, and it's how we create logical proofs in general. And then, of course, on a more just experiential side of things, right, we need to be exploring novelty, but skeptically, right? We don't want to eschew novelty. We don't want to assume that all ground has been covered. So it is important for us to kind of trailblaze and find new ground, even if it's just new to us and not necessarily new to the world. It's impossible to know everything. We're pretty certain our brains cannot actually even store the amount of data that exists in the world. So we want to explore novelty, but we want to do so skeptically. And again, that brings us back up to Socratic inquiry, scientific method. And then, again, the end result there is establishing models, right? And, this is going to be theorems and heuristics and models of all sorts, right? And this brings us back to one of my favorite quotes, and I'm forgetting the guy's name again. He was just a statistician. But it's all models are wrong, but some models are useful. And this is where it brings us to in martial arts and training. There is so much that we do not know, that we do not have experimental evidence for, that we have at best anecdotes for, or even just hypotheses for. But if we can go through our methods of inquiry and our methods of discovery and some just good basic problem solving and navigating through biases and fallacies and whatnot, we can actually establish models that tend to work. And again, going back to this self-determination theory stuff, one of the things that we need to know is, right, if we're talking about autonomy and relatedness and competence, we are talking about individual-based approach, which, funny enough, if you look up Socratic education, and this is really important, this is something I've actually been looking into, because we all like learn about the Socratic inquiry thing in like philosophy class or whatever, and this is high school level stuff. But there's actually Socratic education, like Socratic classrooms. And because I am going to be a parent very soon, in fact, by the time this video gets released, I may already be. Because of my position as a martial arts instructor, because you generally don't find yourself very busy during the day, that is going to afford me the chance to homeschool the kids, which I think is a far better option. And I'm exploring the Socratic method of inquiry, the Socratic method of education, because it works in with self-determination theory, and the schools that employ it, or schools that are similar, like Montessori and Waldorf and whatnot, tend to get better results, right? The factory classroom, the the classroom factory industrial complex doesn't produce good results. It just does not produce good results. Since the establishment of the Department of Education, I think it was 1980, everything has gone downhill, like rapidly and sequentially. So, I was born in '82. So basically, from the time I was born until today, we have seen a steady decline in educational output, in American performance, because that factory classroom model does not work. So I'm looking into this stuff, and I figured I would at least share some of the stuff that I'm already familiar with you guys, because I think this is important, not just in our own training, right? But if we're going to be teachers, if we're going to be coaching other people, even if you're not teaching children regular education, right? Like building them up from their ABCs and 1, 2, 3s up into mathematics and logic and literature and civics and stuff like that. Even if you're just a humble kickboxing coach, you can find a lot more success by addressing your students as individuals. The factory approach of everybody is the same, everybody must learn the same things, just doesn't work out too well. We know that there is so much intra-individual variation in things like movement patterns and thought processes. Even people who are experts in things do the same thing differently on different occasions, or within the same practice, right? Within the same repetition scheme, there are slight variations in movement, and that's because there's always slight variations in the environment, and we have to compensate for those things. We constantly have to be compensating for our own biological conditions and our environmental conditions, and that even is the progress over time, over the course of seconds and minutes, and hours and so on. So you're never going to get same. You're going to find kind of stable, broad patterns with a lot of variation within that, right? And so going back to the self-determination theory and how we're looking at this from a detective point of view, is we really want to establish this idea of kind of detective work with ourselves, with our own practice, with our students, with the idea of, let's define what we're trying to do. Let's define what our problem solving is. Let's define the terms that we're using. Let's define what the skill set is. And then let's allow room for individuation within that. Because are we after aesthetic sameness, or are we after functional performance and success, right? And so there are landmarks we should probably be hitting, things like safety and not injuring yourself, and effective production of power and tactical reliability and things like that, right? But those are still very broad concepts, right? This is why in Wing Chun we talk about things being principle-based rather than technique-based. Whether or not people train that way is a different story, but we do need to be looking at things from a principle base, from a context base, from a conceptual base, rather than from a everybody must do this thing this way, otherwise it's wrong. This is part of the reason why there's that whole argument about like dogma, and this was Bruce Lee's crusade, and everybody else's crusade, right? This is the whole like argument between combat sports and traditional martial arts, or reality-based self-defense and traditional martial arts. People are trying to get past this factory atmosphere of everybody get in line, do things the same way, right? Factory or military sameness doesn't really produce the results that we're looking for, and there has to be a better way, right? So there has to be some detective work. So anyway, that's the video. I've rambled on long enough. Hopefully that's some food for thought, and I will talk to you guys later. Good journey. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, share. Check us out on our other socials, and please head over to blacksunboxing.com to get a little more info, including how to contact us. Furthermore, if you are in the Phoenix area, please feel free to stop in, say hi, join in for a class, whatever. Also, if you ever see us cite sources or just for additional content, please check out our Substack. That is where we put all of the sources we use in our videos and is a major part of this. Plus, it serves as a membership platform for long distance learning and for people who would like to support us but aren't local. We would greatly appreciate it if you signed up. Even just the free membership helps us out a lot. All right, I will see you guys in the next video. Good journey.